The word proof actually means to demonstrate that something cannot be any other way. People will often say, Levi, you cannot prove that God exists. And other people will say, you can't scientifically prove that God exists. Well, did you know that you cannot prove anything at all in life? You can't prove to me now, you can't show to me or demonstrate that you're not having a bad dream. You cannot demonstrate that there could be no other possibilities of your reality right now. And what I mean by that is you cannot prove it, but what you can do is come to a reasonable conclusion based on the evidence, and that's what you're doing right now. You conclude, hey, the evidence tells me that I'm not asleep, I'm awake. I'm not asleep, I'm watching a YouTube video right now and I'm awake, and that evidence leads you to believe that. Likewise, the evidence, I believe, as we examine the evidence, we can come to a conclusion based on the evidence. And that leads to the conclusion that God does exist. Based on the evidence. It's not blind faith, but it's based on the evidence. And this YouTube series, these playlists are all about examining the evidence and asking ourselves, well, what is the most reasonable conclusion to make based on these evidences? And each video we're going to be investigating one single evidence per video. Today we're going to be talking about life. And so that's the big idea. We're going to step through each of these evidences and each time revealing another aspect. And by the end of it, we're going to work all of these aspects together. By video 4, we're going to have demonstrated that it is absolutely reasonable to believe that God exists. In fact, it is most reasonable to believe that God exists, and it is unreasonable to believe that God doesn't. By video 4, so stay tuned, keep watching. Today we're going to be talking about life. So what can we, and we're going to be talking about concepts like abiogenesis, the idea that life came from non-life. And so where do we start? Well, we look at the world around us. We look to nature. We look to people. We look to cells. We look to animals. We look to what we can observe. So what do we observe? Because the study of science is to know. Science means knowledge. And what we're looking at is the creation, or whatever you believe it to be, the world around us, nature. And so as we look at nature, we find that life comes from life. 100 times out of 100, 100% of the time, life comes from life. We see human beings giving birth to human beings. We see animals giving birth to animals. We see trees producing seeds, which then give rise and life to new trees. You see trees produce trees. The plants produce plants. And so we see life coming from life. And cells, people often will raise the idea, hey, cells produce cells. Well, cells are incredibly complex living organisms. The complexity blows our minds what happens down in the cell. But the life of a cell produces another cell. Cells produce cells. And so we always have this idea that life is producing life, and everywhere we look we see life producing life, but we've never seen an instance where non-life brings into existence life. Life comes from life. And so what can we conclude based on that evidence? Well, we can conclude that it is most reasonable to believe that life originally came from life. And so that's the big idea. That's this video. It's not a long video, but that's the concept I want you to understand, that it is absolutely reasonable to believe that life came from life. Why? Because we see it happening everywhere around us. This idea that life couldn't come from life is just horrible. It's unreasonable. It's illogical. Life always comes from life. That's what we observe, and so that's what's most reasonable. But we never observe life coming from non-life, so we have to conclude that that's not reasonable. And so the idea of abiogenesis, as wishful and as hopeful as it sounds, and as magnificent as the stories may appear, as the scientists try and theorize theories about how abiogenesis could have taken place, how life could have spontaneously arose from non-life, well, as amazing as they sound, it's just not what's most reasonable. It's just not in alignment with what we observe. And so the science of what we can test and observe observe leads us to the conclusion that it is most reasonable that life came from life. So keep that in your mind as we move on to the next evidences, that life most likely came from life, and that it is very reasonable to believe that, and it is unreasonable to believe the opposite. Thanks, stay tuned for the next video.